Whether you're new to Victoria 3 or you're an experienced player, I highly recommend you watch this video because we're going to be going through the entirety of the political screen, explaining everything from government, agitators, legislation, including what's the best legislation and why and when to change your legislation, very important aspects, your institutions, and most importantly, why you should be subscribed if you like to see your wallet again. The first tab is of course the overview tab. It is extremely useful to better understand what is happening in your country from a political perspective. We see our ruling monarch, in our case that is King Friedrich Wilhelm von Hohenzollern right now, with our heir being Prince Friedrich Wilhelm von Hohenzollern. Clearly there's a lot of originality when it comes to naming kids in 1800s Prussia. We can see the ideology of our current monarch as well as of our heir if we hover over them, as well as the interest group which they are a part of, their popularity, as well as the traits that he's got, namely direct and defensive strategist. This one affects him as a commander, whilst direct affects him not only as a commander, which offers 10% offense if we make him a commander, but also as interest group leader should he become one. If one of these is not active, it does say in between brackets inactive, pretty self-explanatory. If we hover over the name, we'll see quickly here his ideology, interest group, and character traits. Very important thing here, the ideology and the interest group are the main things you need to look out for in your leadership, because whatever interest group your leader is going to be a part of and whatever ideology he might have will massively influence the power of your interest groups, as well as what legislation you will be able to pass, as well as how much support you will have for passing certain legislations. In our case, because he is a royalist, he strongly endorses monarchy. The amount of loyalists and radicals is also exposed from day one, and you can see each interest group, how many loyalists and radicals they have. This will be extremely different as you go along in your campaign, but it's always a good idea to see from this particular overview screen which interest group is more radicalized, so you know that you should probably get more approval with that interest group, make them happy in one way or another by either passing legislation or choosing various more favorable to lower the amount of radicals and increase the amount of loyalists. We also have the political lobbies. What are political lobbies? Well, a new mechanic that allows you to get either plus 10 approval or minus 10 approval, namely disapproval, with your interest groups. Now, interest groups will either join or leave these particular lobbies. So whatever lobbies you might start with at the beginning of the campaign, they might disappear, or the initial interest groups within these lobbies might migrate to another. So it's always a good idea to keep an eye on them. If it's a pro certain country lobby, then appeasing that country increases the approval, and vice versa for anti-political lobby. So the anti-French lobby, if we declare a rivalry with the French, for example, there you go, we just increased by 4 the appeasement with the anti-French association, which means now we have a solid +5 approval with the Junkers simply from this particular lobby. We also see here whatever political movements we might have right now. A political movement is basically something that can randomly start off in your country based on the ideologies and the strength of the various political groups in your country, and sometimes they might help you pass certain legislation that you want or that you don't want. Agitators are unique individuals around the world that you can invite to your country, and they will start movements, political movements, to enact certain legislation. For example, here Giuseppe Mazzini would like to enact universal suffrage, which allows everybody in your country to vote, which is not amazing at the start of the campaign. We'll get into that in a few moments why. Whatever the case, if you click show only available, we'll have no agitators. That's because neither one of these boys here is an accepted culture. So you can only invite agitators that are accepted cultures. So if you have multiculturalism, you can invite these 3 guys, or if you have cultural exclusion, you can invite them as well, since they are European heritage, I believe, right? Yeah, he is Italian, he's Argentinian, he's Platinian, which again is European heritage, and he's South Andean. So for those, it only requires a racial segregation to be able to invite them as agitators in our country. That's kind of one of the main beauties about playing as a European heritage country. You have a lot of agitators most of the times to help you pass legislation. Now take note, when you do invite agitators, check first off the interest groups that they are a part of will influence the legislation that they will start political movements, or the legislation that they will overall support. And even more important in my opinion than the interest group is actually the ideology. So this guy here is a radical. That means that he's going to support census suffrage, universal suffrage, protect protected speech, guaranteed liberties, but he's going to be against other legislation which the intelligentsia in my country is pro, but he's against it because of his ideology. So keep an eye on that. Agitators can be a godsend, or they can be horrible if they come to your country and you cannot get rid of them. Of course, you can get agitators that are not an accepted culture via events, so always make sure you check what kind of personalities you invite in your lands. When it comes to the government screen, fairly straightforward. We have the monarch at the top, we have the government, and we have the interest groups within the government, as well as the interest groups in the opposition, not in government, but hopeful that one day they will become a part of the government. If we click here, we also have the marginalized interest groups. The marginalized interest groups basically have so little clout that they are just irrelevant. As such, you cannot get any of the bonuses from these interest groups like workforce ratio, manufacturing industries, and state construction efficiency from the trade unions because they are marginalized. So even if they had plus 20 relations or approval and you had all of these traits, you would not get the benefits. That being said, we are right now getting family ties, which offers 20% influence, and if we get a little bit more approval, we're going to get 20% authority as well, which is a big deal because we already start with quite a little bit of authority. If we get disapproval, once it reaches -5, we will get a debuff. Every single interest group has its own unique 2 bonuses and 1 debuff. I recommend whatever country you're playing as, go through each individual interest group's bonuses and debuff because they're going to be different from country to country. The industrialists from the Prussians have different bonuses from the industrialists that Qing has, and so on. Every interest group also supports specific legislation via their ideology. So the Junkers are stratocratic, meaning they support peasant levies, serfdom, consumption-based taxation, no social security. They're basically horrible. In general, at the start of the campaign, every single Junkers, or better yet, a landowner interest group, is the worst. Landowners, the church, are the 2 groups you do not want to support. So right now, if we click on the church, we can see that we are bolstering them. That means that we are attracting more population for this particular interest group. We're going to stop that. This costs 200 authority points. So instead of wasting that for bolstering the church, which is not something we like, we could instead suppress them for 200 authority points, meaning less population is going to be attracted to this particular interest group. Take note, you cannot suppress interest groups that are in your government. You can only suppress interest groups that are in the opposition, but you can bolster interest groups that are in your government. However, some interest groups have multiple ideologies, like the intelligentsia have 4 ideologies. So it's always a good idea before you start your campaign to just hover all of them to see what everybody would like to pass as legislation for your country, so you know which type of interest group you would like to eventually get in your government. And these ideologies can also be changed via journal entries, via events. Not only can the ideology be changed, but you can also change the IG traits. The Buddhist monks, both the traits and the ideology get completely changed once we adopt state Shinto. Your government also has a legitimacy bar. Lower legitimacy is bad. If you go below 25, you will not be able to continue with your legislation changes. So say for example, we're trying to get peasant levies for whatever reason, right? Well, this has 75 days between checkpoints. Now these 75 days would completely stop if our legitimacy is below 25. If it's between 25 and 50, we do get some radical debuffs. That means more radicals from standard of living decrease. The time to enact legislation increases by 50%, as well as every single interest group in the opposition gets -2 approval. Between 50 and 75, you just get -1 opposition interest group approval. 75 and 90, you get loyalists, so that is a good buff, plus 25% from standard of living increase. And 90 to 100, you get enactment time reduction. Another very important thing to note, once you have certain technologies unlocked, you will get political parties. That is exactly how you get political parties, because I've had people asking me this. It's very specific technologies. The earliest party you'll be getting is the Progress Party. Once you've researched empiricism, then once you've gotten stock exchange, you also get the Free Conservative Party. Now, these political parties do have different names based on what country you're playing as, and they obviously attract interest groups that align with the ideology of these particular political parties. For example, the Anarchist political party, as it's called in Germany, the Anarchist Society, will attract interest groups that are more anarchical, like the trade unions. To a certain extent, they can attract the peasants, or whatever the peasants interest group is called in your country. Saying goes, after you research socialism, you'll get the Communist Party, which will attract more communist inclined interest groups. Once you've gotten political agitation, you'll get the Nazi Party if you're playing as the Germans, and that's going to attract the petite bourgeoisie, intelligentsia to a certain extent. It depends, of course. Your interest groups will join different political parties as a result of the voting process, which is why right now we do have these technologies, but we don't have political parties. Why is that? Well, that's because our legislation does not allow a free voting system. We are an autocracy, meaning we cannot have political parties. We will get political parties if we have a voting system, like say we go landed voting. That's going to allow for political parties to form. As you can see here, it says, when enacted, this will cause parties to emerge. The first three types of distribution of power are non-elected. Technocracy is government where you have a council of men of reason and ability, as it says, together with your leader. And then oligarchy, basically similar to autocracy. All the other ones below, landed voting all the way to universal suffrage, is party-based political systems. Anarchy is essentially a massive debuff that you don't want to go down the path of. And then single party state, you have a single legal political party and all the other ones are outlawed. Now, that being said, that political party can be multiple interest groups. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be just one interest group. You can have political parties with quite a few interest groups, actually. Since we did switch to the laws, let's talk about this now. We have three types of legislation: human rights, economy, and power structure. Obviously, the more important ones are the economical ones and the power structure ones, but human rights also come into play later down in the campaign, with the exception of slavery. This is extremely important from day one, of course. So the governing principles, you can either be a monarchy, which most nations start off as, then you can either be a presidential republic or parliamentary republic. The difference is that as a presidential republic, you do get some authority, but you also get some penalty from ideological incompatibility. With this one, you do get a president, whilst with the parliamentary republic, kind of the same. Parliamentary one, you do get a chancellor instead, and you don't get the penalty that you get from the presidential republic. Overall, parliamentary republic is really great in the later part of the campaign if you can enact it. Theocracy is kind of the same like a monarchy, but the church, whatever type of church you might have, will be the one in charge. And council republic is essentially the commies, which also offers a buttload of political strength to the trade unions. And it unlocks the ability to have the cooperative ownership legislation for the economic system, which essentially disables the private investment pool. So 100% of your economy is managed by you. Nothing is given away or privatized. So it can be good, but it can also be really bad depending on whether you're a good player or not. So keep that in mind. Your citizenship legislation basically defines what population within your country will be accepted and what population will not be accepted. The higher up on the tier, the more authority points that you get, as well as radicals decrease from standard of living and loyalists increase. The lower you go, the less of that, with multiculturalism giving none of it. That being said, if you go on ethno-state, only your primary culture is an accepted population. Everybody else is discriminated against. So in our case, if we were an ethno-state, only North Germans would be accepted. Even South Germans would be discriminated as consequence. If you're a national supremacy, then any culture that shares a cultural trait that is not a heritage cultural trait with your primary culture will be accepted. So what does that mean? If we go back to North German and we hover over German speaking, only North-South Germans and Alemannics will be accepted with the national supremacy citizenship legislation. If we go for racial segregation, a heritage cultural trait with your primary culture defines who is accepted. So if we have this, then that means we accept any other culture that is European heritage, which is more than half of the planet, to be honest. Like I was saying earlier, if you do have European as your primary culture, any of the European cultures here, you're set, because you don't need any other legislation for most of the campaign except the racial segregation. Cultural exclusion is pretty much bait. Essentially, it accepts a cultural trait with any primary culture in the country, including heritage ones. So keep that in mind. The difference between national supremacy and this one is that it includes heritage ones. So that means all the Anglophones in the case of the Yankees and all the European heritage cultures would be accepted. That being said, in most cases, this is actually not going to make much of a difference. You might as well stay with racial segregation until you switch over to multiculturalism, which flat out accepts benefits everybody all over the planet, no matter what kind of culture they have. So nobody gets discriminated if you go for multiculturalism. The only case in which this would actually be good is if, say, you had two cultures as your primary culture in your country. One of them had like European heritage, the other one had, I don't know, Asian heritage or something of the sorts. There's no Asian heritage, but there is, for example, North Asian heritage, right? And that would imply that you accept all the Europeans plus all the North Asians, but there's no country that has that as far as I know. So because of that, this literally is bait. Never go for cultural exclusion. Church and state defines what religions you accept and what religions you discriminate against. If you're set to state religion, you get a massive authority buff, as well as you get political strength for your church interest group and some more bonuses, but only your primary religion is accepted. Everybody else that, say in our case, is not Protestant gets discriminated. So all the Catholics would get discriminated in our country. If you set it to freedom of conscience, as long as a religion in your country has a shared trait with the state religion, then it is accepted. So in our case, Protestant is Christian, so all the Christian faiths will be accepted. Everybody that's not Christian is going to be discriminated. Total separation essentially allows every religion to be accepted. Doesn't matter what you are as a religion, you will not get discriminated. And this is by far the best legislation, even though the other ones do come with authority and some other bonuses. This essentially allows significantly more of your population, if you grow in size a lot, to not get discriminated from their religious views. State atheism is basically the same like state religion. Difference is that you do not give a political strength to your church, you take it away from the church. Atheism also becomes the state religion and people convert to atheism. You get a bonus to that, and you start with 10% of the population in your incorporated states as atheists the second that you switch to this. This is also kind of bait. It's honestly just best to go for total separation. Bureaucracy is really important because this is a legislation that can be good or bad depending on the time frame and on the country that you're playing as. So we started with appointed bureaucrats, which offers political strength for the bureaucrats and taxation capacity plus 25%. We also have hereditary bureaucrats, which will attract more aristocrats towards the intelligentsia, but it disallows council republic and governing principles, offers political strength for aristocrats, and lowers bureaucratical costs from population cost modifier by 25%. A lot of nations start with this bureaucratic system. It's not really the best. The bonuses it offers are average at best because bureaucratic population cost multiplier is not that big. If you are struggling with bureaucracy, it's better to go for elected bureaucrats, which offers 15% bureaucracy institution cost modifier. What does that mean? In the early phase of the campaign, you're not going to have many institutions. So we have only 3 levels of institutions here, 2 levels in education, 1 level in law enforcement. So it costs us roughly what, 397 it costs us. Right now our bureaucratic costs are as following: 1,100 bureaucratic costs, 669 of that from the 13 million population that we have, and 300 from the institutions. As we progress in the campaign, the cost for bureaucracy from population is not that much compared to the cost from institutions. I'll give as an example my Spain campaign. If we go to bureaucracy, so it costs us 4,000 for the population, 104 million, and it costs us 26,000 bureaucracy from the institutions. By contrast, that's like 8 times more than the population one. So our legislation right now is elected bureaucrats, which makes the institution 15% cheaper. If we had hereditary bureaucrats, it would make the population cost 25% cheaper. So that would be like 1,000 cheaper, but the elected bureaucrats offers us 4,000 discount to bureaucracy, which is significantly more. Plus, it does not have the political strength for the aristocrats, and you want to take as much away of the political strength that the aristocrats have and distribute it to the other population if possible. Now, when it comes to your army models, we start mostly with peasant levies, unless you're Prussia or some other good nations that start with professional army. I'll cut straight to the chase. The best one is professional army. In the later part of the campaign, it might be worth switching to mass conscription, because a lot of the times the trade unions and the armed forces is going to force you to go for that legislation. But the reality is that professional army is still better even in the later part of the campaign, because the armed forces political strength that you get from this doesn't really matter much. Almost 80% of the campaign after the initial phase, the armed forces have little to no actual political strength. So this extra bonus here doesn't make much of a difference. The added benefit though is that you get the morale loss, which is huge. Weekly unit experience gain is pretty good as well, plus 25, and maximum barrack level plus 100. Mass conscription also gives you 100 barracks level, but it also gives morale loss plus 5%, which is pretty bad. It does make up for that with the conscription rate increased by 2%, which is not bad. So it really depends on whether you're playing a multiplayer or a single player. In single player with professional army, you don't need to struggle for the rest of the campaign. In multiplayers, it is a little bit more of a slog, and you're gonna have to have like 6,000-7,000 battalions by the later part of the campaign. But if you're playing multiplayer, you probably know what you're doing, right? Internal security, you can either have no internal security, you can go for National Guard, which allows you to recruit more battalions as conscripts, as well as it reduces the political movement radicalism and gives more conscription rate. Secret police increases the amount of home affair levels that you have. This is big because with the National Guard, you can only get level 3 home affairs maximum. With the secret police and guaranteed liberties, you can go all the way to up level 5. The main one to take from the secret police is the 50% political movement radicalism. So essentially, if you go for this and you upgrade it to level 5, you almost never need to worry about massive political movements to stop you from enacting whatever legislation you're enacting. Guaranteed liberties, however, removes the radicalism from political movement, but it gives radicals reduction from standard of living decrease with the loyalist increase by 25, which is huge, especially in the later part of the campaign. It means that, look at us, we got 46 million population loyalists and 1 million radicals. One of the reasons why that is because of guaranteed liberties. When it comes to your economic system, a lot of nations start with traditionalism, which is really the actual worst. It offers so many debuffs. You really want to get rid of this as soon as possible. It absolutely cripples your country. Not only does it give taxation capacity minus 25%, meaning you collect 25% less taxes from your population, but it also gives market access price impact minus 15% and a lot of other debuffs. Pretty self-explanatory. Get rid of traditionalism. Interventionalism is kind of like the middle ground here. Doesn't offer any amazing buffs, but it doesn't have any debuffs. It gives 50% of the construction sectors to the private sector, and 50% you can use for yourself to build building yourself. You also have government dividends, reinvestment 50%, and you cannot nationalize buildings without paying for those buildings getting nationalized. Agrarianism is similar to interventionalism with the difference that it gives more contribution efficiency to the investment pool for aristocrats, farmers, and clergy, and you get 5% more government dividends efficiency, which is actually quite good, not gonna lie. But the contribution efficiency from capitalists is lowered by 25, so that's a little bit of a debuff. Industry band, pretty self-explanatory. This is a result of usually very bad management of your country. It's a massive debuff, and I do not recommend you ever go for this intentionally. Laissez-faire is by far the best type of economic system. It gives 75% construction allocation to the private sector, so that means you only can use 25% of the construction sectors that you have for yourself. The rest the private sector will build. You also get one extra company. Interest rate minus 25. That is the big one right there. It means that you can scale up and increase your economic output significantly faster by taking a lot of credit and paying very little to nothing in return for that credit and interest. You cannot nationalize. You will have to privatize all of your buildings, however, so keep that in mind. Cooperative ownership is basically the communist version of an economy, not the greatest of ones. And then command economy is where you essentially take direct control of the entirety of the economy, and all of the funds in the investment pool will be taken by the government. So in my case here, I've got 809 million in the investment pool. I would get 809 million as my own money if I was to go command economy, and basically I would disable the investment pool as well as the private sector would disappear altogether. You get some authority bonus, efficiency for government dividends. This is actually not a bad legislation, to be honest. If you know what you're doing and you know how to play the game, this is actually extremely overpowered, and it's pretty hard to get because it is pretty overpowered. Trade policy, isolation is bad. Mercantilism, meh. Protectionism can be so-so because you do get a little bit of money from tariffs, but the real money is for free trade, because free trade, despite not giving any tariff money, does increase the trade volume, so you can trade more by 50% more. It costs 50% less bureaucracy to trade, and you get 50% trade route competitiveness, which means more nations would be more willing to trade with you. So let me give you an example. If we go to our trade routes right now, we have, for example, one of our trade routes with the Russians for tools. We get 40,000 from that alone, and the more trade routes you have, the more money you get, of course. So if you like to rely on trade a lot, free trade or protectionism is the way, in my opinion. Isolationism does give a lot of authority points, but it gives technology technology spread reduction, and it disables trade routes. So unless you're a masochist, I don't know what to tell you. Your taxation legislation determines what exactly gets taxed. So consumption-based taxation essentially only taxes consumption tax, 35% consumption tax rate. Land-based taxation has income tax rate, consumption tax rate, and a flat land tax rate. Per capita taxation has a per capita taxation as well as a land tax, and the income tax rate is increased from 7% to 15%, with the consumption tax remaining at 35%. So as you can see, these legislations, you get more and more tax as you go further down, with the highest one barely any taxes, land-based taxation a little bit more, and per capita taxation significantly more than the other ones. Then proportional taxation taxes income tax, consumption tax. There's no flat tax rate, but like we have here for the per capita and land tax, however, this does have a dividends tax rate of 10%, and with the graduated taxation, that increases to 20% dividends tax rate. As you progress in the campaign, you will get more and more dividends. We've got here government dividends, and we also have dividends taxes, basically taxes directly imposed on the financial districts, manor houses, trade centers, and urban centers. The reason why proportional taxation has less dividends tax and more income tax compared to graduated, which has more dividends and less income by 10%, is because in the last part of the campaign, you're going to get a lot more from dividends compared to the income tax, and vice versa. So ideally, you want to go proportional taxation by, say, 1880s, when you start to build up a semi-decent industrial output and you have enough dividends to be taxing your financial districts, manor houses, and so on. And then graduated taxation is something you want to switch around the 1920s or 1910s, depending on how fast your economy has grown and how much you can actually tax dividends wise here. When it comes to the land reforms, the worst one you can have is serfdom, because not only does it give 50% political strength for the landowners, the one interest we do not want any political strength for, but it does not allow migration between provinces, so you cannot migrate people between your states, and you also don't have the ability to allow mass migration for your peasants. Tenant farmers allows mass migration, but it does not allow internal migration between states. So what does that mean? It means that if, for example, we were to build, I don't know, an iron mine in this province, but we don't have qualified people to work that in this province, we have them in the adjacent province. Even though there are qualified people in that province to work the mines there in Kanto, they will not be able to go to Kanto to work in those mines because we have serfdom, so they're only allowed to work in their particular state. That is an economy killer. So you want to get rid of serfdom as soon as possible. Tenant farmers is equally bad because it still has the same problem of not being able to go between states, although it does have less political strength for the landowners by 25%. Homesteading is usually the one you're going to be able to switch to early on in the campaign, as it does get some support from the peasantry. Going homesteading will also attract more middle strata pops to the petite bourgeoisie from rural buildings, so keep that in mind. And it offers some political strength to the farmers, which is not so bad, because that political strength kind of counteracts a little bit the landowner political strength, especially in the early part of the campaign. So going homesteading and then also switching to agrarianism means that you have a balance of landowners with peasants, and that way you can start switching and getting more legislation a little bit faster in the early part of the campaign, instead of just having either only landowners or only peasants, which means that you're going to be stuck with certain legislation and not be able to switch around much. Commercialized agriculture removes the bonuses for the farmers, and it will encourage the lower strata pops to join the trade union interest group more, and the collectivized agriculture is essentially the trade union commie specialty, if you know what I mean. Colonization, fairly straightforward. No colonial affairs. You cannot colonize. Frontier colonization means you can only colonize provinces that you have an adjacent province to. So we can colonize Hokkaido and Sakhalin because we have adjacent provinces to those, but we cannot colonize with frontier colonization anywhere else on the planet. Usually the nations that start with frontier colonization are Japan, USA, Mexico, and the Canadian, various Canadian nations. Colonial exploitation allows you to colonize anywhere in the world, with the exception of areas where you do not have a claim, like South America. Only nations with a claim can colonize there. It does mean you get 25% tension decay reduction, so your tension will go down a little bit slower, and you get some throughput bonus in unincorporated states, not in incorporated ones, keep that in mind. Also, colonial resettlement gives migration attraction in unincorporated states. Police force allows you to remove state penalty from turmoil. The local police force also gives political strength for the shogunate or the landowners. So when it comes to level 5, this would be 25 political strength at level 5. Dedicated police force removes that political strength, and it also adds radicals from standard of living decrease. So you really want to get this. This is actually perfect. Militarized police force gives political strength for the samurai or the land forces, as well as it lowers even more radicals. School system, very important. A lot of the times you'll be able to get religious schools early on because the various religious interest groups will support this. Take note, this means with every single level of institution for your education, you get 10% political strength for the religious interest group, as well as you get conversion speed to your primary religion and education access. Private schools, by contrast, give percentage wealth education access, which is wealth-based, and intelligentsia political strength. So this is kind of super situational. If, say, you are a very small country with a very rich population, then this is for you. If you don't have that and you're literally anybody else on the planet, or most countries, go for public schools. Public schools gives a simulation, making accepted cultures your primary cultures, because remember, you can only convert cultures that are not discriminated. So in our case, we cannot convert the Han to Japanese because they are discriminated right now. If we switch legislation and we accept them, then we also convert them to Japanese eventually, or assimilate them. The added bonus for public schools is that you also do not give any political strength for the religious interest group. Health system, similar to education, whereas the charity hospitals give political strength for the religious interest group and the public health insurance does not. Same amount of standard of living, 0.5 per level for the lower strata with charity hospitals and public health insurance. Mortality decreased by 3% per level for charity hospitals, 4% per level for public health insurance, and pollution effect reduction by 15%, 10% for the charity hospital. So public health insurance is way better, not to mention it also gives 2 more maximum health system institution levels, whereas the charity hospitals does not give the extra 2 levels. And private health insurance is the same as a public one, with the exception that the standard of living affects only the wealthy and the upper class, and you get 10% pollution effect reduction. When it comes to human rights, there's been some major changes actually. So if you start with slavery ban, that's perfect. You don't need anything else from here. However, if you have debt slavery, it will give 25% shogunate political strength, and whoever cannot pay off their loans will become a slave in your country. Legacy slavery also gives 25% political strength for the landowners, and whoever is a slave will stay a slave, but you will not be getting any new slaves, so keep that in mind. Slave trade, full-on slavery here, 50% political strength for the landowners, and you really want to get rid of this legislation because slavery means you will not have people that pay taxes and have their own income. We want people to be able to pay our taxes. That's the main goal of the game. So no slaves because y'all need to pay taxes. Migration, self-explanatory. No migration control means that anybody can migrate to your country regardless if they are accepted or not. Migration control means that only accepted cultures can migrate. So anybody that's discriminated cannot join us. Closed, nobody can migrate. Social security, poor laws means that you give some welfare payment for the poor. However, if they do receive welfare, they also get political strength reduction. So they don't really have much of a say anymore if they are poor. Wage subsidies, you only give out the welfare payment. That's it, no bonuses. So this is pretty bad. You don't want to go for this. Old age pension is actually not so bad. You get dependence income, enfranchisement, but it reduces the workforce ratio a little bit. So this is actually pretty good for the late part of the campaign where the workforce ratio doesn't matter as much because you're going to have hundreds of millions of pops anyway. Right of women starts with legal guardianship in most nations, which means you get extra 5% birth rate. Properly tied women gives workforce ratio plus 5%. Women in the workspace gives 10% workforce ratio and 5% reduction for birth rate. And women's suffrage gives 15% workforce ratio, 33% dependence enfranchisement, and reduced 5% birth rate. Pretty much you have to go for women's suffrage in most campaigns because there's going to be a lot of movements for this, and if you don't go for that, you're going to destroy your country, so you just have to click on this, whatever the case. Children's rights starts pretty bad, and this offers dependence income, but it does give mortality rate plus 5% for quite a few of your population. Then restrict child labor lowers the mortality rate, and it also lowers the income, but it also increases the education level for your institution. Compulsory primary education gives 2 max education institution level and nothing nothing else, this is the one you want to go for because it allows you to go all the way up to level 5 with your education institution. Labor rights, regulatory bodies means you reduce the dangerous working conditions, meaning you're gonna increase your population a little bit more faster. It's not a big deal, but it's like a little percentage more pops. Worker protection, it increases the minimum wage alongside the worker danger conditions improvements, so it will increase the standard of living overall in your country from this. Free speech, outlaw dissent means a lot of authority points, but technology spread reduction. Censorship, exactly the same, but basically half with less technology spread reduction. However, it also allows for bolstering 40% and suppressing minus 40% for interest groups. Right of assembly, you get half authority what you get from censorship, less bolstering and suppression, but you don't get the technology spread debuff, and it allows you to go for guaranteed liberties in your internal security. Protected speech gives only technology spread and leverage resistance. So for the later part of the campaign, this is awesome because it means you're going to have hundreds in your technology spread from that bonus with all the extra innovation points from the extra universities you're going to have. Now, this is what in my Spanish game institutions look like. At the start, some nations start with no institutions. Eventually, you will get institutions, both from legislation. Like I said earlier, compulsory primary school allows us to go all the way up to level 5 with our education. Otherwise, we would be stuck at level 3. And also, some technologies will unlock more institution levels. Usually, these are technologies from the society technology tree. The higher the institution level, the more bonuses you get from that particular institution, but also you get a per level bureaucracy cost. So level 5 colonial affairs cost us 862 times 5, whatever the schnapps that might be. I want you to take a close look at education here. We also get 50% maximum innovation investment, 25% in technology spread, and minus 25 ahead of time penalty for technology as well. Why is that? Well, that's because we have the power block with the advanced research principle. This improves our institution. So if we were to have this principle but our education was level 1, then we would only get a limited amount, only 10% max innovation investment, technology spread, and so on. If we get rid of this principle, then we also lose the institution bonuses, so keep that in mind. There's some other principles that also increase your institution bonuses, like for example, police coordination will give you 50 authority per level of law enforcement and 5 political movement radicalism. So I'm just going to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Let's go ahead and get level 3 police coordination. Now if you go over to the institution, look at that. We get 250 authority minus 25 political movement radicalization from law enforcement level 5. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something. If you did, don't forget to also subscribe and let me know if you want me to do an economic guide similar to this one. Love you all and I'll see you in the next one.